presentation at Lehigh this Sunday there, anniversary up there in the retirement of Michael Ruger, who a number of you know. So Leon, if I can say this, is a gem of that particular technical discipline. And what I think is wonderful about Leon, besides being a very fun person to be around, is that he's very giving at this time. Between the So, without further ado,
wow.
Leon.
Thanks, Alice. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, despite the temperature. So I'm going to talk about designing warehouses. So yesterday, Kevin did exactly what I hoped someone would do, which was trying to get a sense of who's teaching what to whom. So let me ask a follow-on question to the questions that Kevin asked yesterday. If you are going to be teaching material handling, would you or would you not, would you consider teaching at least some part of the material on warehouse design? Just a show of hands. Okay, that's good. So Jim talked about warehouse design, and Kevin talked a little bit. Kevin talked about storage systems design, and so did Anant, and so did Sundaresh. So it almost seems like this is the Material Handling Teachers Institute on warehouse design, but not exactly. A lot of what we teach about material handling in general is about analyzing material handling systems, not really about designing them. And this has become clear to me over the last few years through my collaborations with colleagues in mechanical engineering, especially colleagues who are in the design area. And I've come to appreciate just how little we teach, maybe how little we know about design as an activity. And that is true about designing warehouses as well. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. I do research in this area. I have students who do research in this area. I have the benefit of having colleagues at Georgia Tech who do research in this area. So what I'm going to try to convey to you this morning is really the product of picking a lot of people's minds. Jim and I go back a long, long, long way. And despite appearances, Jim is much older than I am. But I've been talking to Jim and working with Jim for well over 20 years. And back in the mid-90s, when we started the Keck Virtual Factory Lab, we did a series of very small workshops where Jim would come over, or Mike Malike, not Mike. Anyway, one of his colleagues came over that he mentioned yesterday, or mentioned Monday, would come over, and we would talk with them about how they do warehouse design. So we learned an awful lot from Jim and his colleagues about how they were doing warehouse design. I have a colleague, now retired, Gunter Sharp, who's taught in this area, done consulting in this area for a long time. Gunter and Mark Huchalix and I have worked together for a long time on this fundamental question of how do you design a warehouse. And of course, lots of colleagues here in the material handling community, in KICME and other colleagues, have influenced my thinking about this. I showed Jim this presentation yesterday morning before he left the hotel. And he was delighted to see that I have used a number of examples from a paper that he and Russ Miller and John White did for the Material Handling Research Colloquium last year. And that paper can be found online at the MHIA website. So if you just go to that, in fact, I think if you just Google IMHRC 2010, it'll take you to the MHI website where you can find that paper. So if you want to go and see the paper, it's there. So here's the fundamental challenge. We don't really have a common semantic model that we all go back to when we talk about warehousing or warehouse design. We all start in our native language, so let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that it's English, and we assume that everybody knows what we're saying when we talk about how to design a warehouse. In fact, that's not true. And one of the hurdles in teaching warehouse design is establishing a common semantic framework for the students. So I'm going to not do that for you today, but I'm going to give you all the elements of that common semantic framework. And at the end, I'll actually have some definitions that you could use if you wanted to do it that way. That semantic framework is really important because when we talk about designing anything, we are necessarily working with abstractions. I don't know how many of us will ever actually get to design a warehouse, probably not many. But if we do, we start working with some abstraction. We don't start working with concrete and steel, with pallet racks and lift trucks. So establishing that common semantic framework is the first step in helping us to develop some shared abstractions that we can use when we talk about warehousing or when we do warehouse design. So that's one of the fundamental challenges is coming up with this common shared set of abstractions. Another challenge is that a warehouse design has a tremendous amount of information content. So in essence, when we do warehouse design, we're going to start with an empty object, an empty piece of paper, an empty whiteboard, whatever it is, and we're going to fill it with information. A lot of information. And where do you start? Last night, for those of us who were there, Kimberly, we were going to paint a Van Gogh. Well, we were going to create a dim image of a faint image of a I would never have known how to start. So fortunately, our instructor said, do this first, and then do this, then do this. So what we got was a workflow for creating that painting. And what we don't have is a useful workflow for designing a warehouse. I'm sure almost all of you have heard some variation of what Jim described as the way Systicon did material handling systems design. You know, define the requirements. You know, he had a set of steps that he said, this is what we went through. Well, that's great, but those steps are themselves such high-level abstractions, it's not really a useful workflow. It's sort of a set of milestones that say, you've come this far when you've done this. But it doesn't tell you how to get between the milestones. So what we have never had in teaching warehouse design is a useful engineering workflow. Without that, it's not surprising when we give students projects that they really fumble around a lot. And we like to kid ourselves and say, well, this is good for them. You know, they need to struggle with the data. Bull! What they need is a set of guidelines that say, do this, paint the canvas first, then do this, draw the little 9, then do this. I mean, so they need a set of steps to go through that are executable, that give them something they can actually do. And then the last thing they need, which we tend to teach first, is the analysis tools. The last thing they need is to know, okay, at what point in this process do I use a particular analysis tool? we tend to teach the analysis tool first. And I think one reason we tend to teach it first is because we don't have this other stuff that makes it easy for us to create a framework within which this analysis tool is useful. So what I hope at the end of this hour you have is some idea about a framework that you could use to teach warehouse design so the students would have an idea what tools to use and when. So when we're talking about warehousing, and especially about warehouse design, we really need three different sets of abstractions. We need a set of abstractions for the thing that's being designed, for the warehouse itself, because we need to be able to talk about that thing very clearly and concisely. We also need a set of abstractions for the design process itself, because when we do design, as you're going to see here in just a minute, we don't start working with warehouse abstractions. We start working with something higher level, something different. Eventually we'll get to words that relate specifically to warehouses, but we don't start there. So we need a different set of abstractions. We need a different semantic model to be able to talk about design itself. And then finally, we do need to be able to talk about analysis. And so that's the goal, is to have a teachable, systematic way of approaching and thinking about warehouse design. My own personal work, my research work, is largely about both creating this semantic framework, but also reducing this semantic framework to a set of computational tools, engineering tools that students could use or that practitioners could use. I'm not going to talk about that at all today. I'm simply going to talk about this first part, which is the semantic part. So we're going to talk about some fundamental concepts,